Hi, it's Dean Homiuni, and we're back again. So we're going to move on to the next lesson, how to stabilize your footage. And we'll talk about general theory. We did have a discussion about this in the guide where we talked about that you want what's called the lockdown effect. And a lockdown effect is where you look at your footage, especially when you're filming on a tripod, and you look at your footage, and that screen should be like a fish tank. And if you have an aquarium in your house, the edges of the fish tank doesn't move. And so you have to imagine your television screen as the edges of the television screen being the edges of a fish tank, especially for the tripod shots. And once again, the video tutorials and the guide work hand in hand. So we talked about using a tripod if possible, if in fact you're allowed to wind up being able to use one, and the things that we mentioned in the guys, such as make sure you find a dive operator that's going to allow you to use a tripod, get all that up front, practice with your camcorder and the housing unit in a pool so you understand the buoyancy factors and you know all the knobs. Because if you get on a boat and you don't know how to use that tripod, they're not going to let you get into water with a tripod. I can tell you that right now. And in fact, if you haven't practiced with a tripod in a pool, you have no business getting in the water and using a tripod, because all you're going to do is wind up damaging the coral. So we're going to look at two different types of stabilization, and we use two different tools. For the tripod shots, we use Boris Continuum Complete image stabilization, which is once again under the film restoration tools. And it's under the film restoration tools because you're restoring film that has a shake. For the shots that we're going along the reef or we're swimming along, we use Adobe Warp Stabilizer, which is a standard part of their effect. So let's get started. And the first part, which is part one of image stabilization, we're going to look at the stabilization tool, which once again is included as part of Boris Continuum Complete. Now, this tool, once again, is CPU extensive. And so you're going to need a fast computer. And then we're also going to talk about some of the rendering issues. So on the screen that we see the film when we were going over this piece of film where we did the denoise. And I've already gone and rendered this file so we don't have to worry about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my Internet Explorer, and I've rendered it out as lesson 2. As we said before, the naming of that file which is rendered is going to match whatever the sequence name is. So once again, that we had that under lesson 2, so the file rendered out as a name lesson 2. So once again, I'm going to grab my file. And I'm just going to drag it into where my assets are at. And I'm going to go through the same things we did before to be organized. So under here, I'm going to come into my film. I'll expand this out a little, go on my little bin creator, and we'll call this lesson 3. Now I'm going to drag my film into that lesson so we're organized. And on the sequence, I'm going to create another sequence called lesson 3. And now we're ready to go. So once again, lesson 3 is popped up. I can leave lesson 2. And one of the other things is you can move these around. You notice how I move in lesson 2 from the left and the right, but I'm just going to wind up closing that out for now. So I drag my film back into the timeline. Oh, sorry, I was trying to drag a sequence. So here I'll drag my film, and there it is. Because we don't have the S3D plugin on here, that we have no effects sitting on this film, we're going to have to put the S3D plugin back on it, which is the plugin for Adobe Premiere Pro. So I'm just going to come down here under Video Effects, go to Vision 3, and I'll drag it in. Voila, it's there. It automatically does side by side when you bring it in, but I'm going to switch it over to the left side because that's the way that I edit. Within here, and once again, you can switch between views. You can go side by side, and they have lots of stuff, line interweaved, and they have anaglyph, which is the red, blue glasses, etc. So on here that we have a piece of film that when we hit the button, you see that shake in the very beginning? Watch. Oh man, look at that film shake. Let's look at it again. So the film is shaking and then it calms down a little bit. So the first thing I do is, because the image stabilization is really going to zoom out the film and manipulate it, that any scenes that you have as part of the clip, which have more shake in them than the rest of the scene, you want to wind up deleting those out. It's all part of the editing process and strategy that we talked about as part of the book. So here it kind of stables down a little. I'm going to go to my splice tool and hold down my shift key. I'm going to wind up, accidentally deleted the whole thing, which of course there's an undo command. So I'll splice it and do a ripple delete. And now I'm sitting here and I go through my film, and on full that we see that we rendered the optical stable, we rendered the denoise out, and the film is playing on full with the S3D plugin. So it goes back to the fact that depending upon the effect, that's going to determine how much resources. So here I'm looking, at this point it's really stable. So there's little movement going on. Clearly the camera had calmed down, and that's why we talk about, if you're going to film a scene, do at least 8 breaths after you have your camcorder set up, so you have plenty of in and out. So here it's really stable. Let's go back to the beginning again. And there's some kind of shake in it, and all this is going to wind up affecting it. So I played through the clip, and I know that I even get more stable. So I'm going to come back into the clip and ripple delete that out. And this is the film, and I can scrub through here. I see that it's actually pretty stable, but it's still moving. Okay, you see those little, if I go through here kind of quick, I have little movement going on, and you can tell by the bottom of the screen. If you look at the bottom of the screen and pick some coral points, you can tell whether or not that there's movement. And we want something that's going to have absolutely no movement to it at all. So here we just have a slight little movement going on. We have these great tools to fix that it makes your film look like it's National Geographic quality level film. All we do is we're going to come back into the Boris Continuum Complete image and restoration tools, and under here they have what's called the optical stabilizer. And once again, I can just drag it onto my film. It brings up these commands. What happens is there's different modes. You can stabilize smooth. I use these two commands. Stabilize, I use it for when I'm on a tripod shot. It completely locks it down. Smooth is when I'm going along the reef. And the stabilize really doesn't work when you're swimming along the reef, because it's trying to analyze the film thinking that you're on a tripod and you're not, and then it just doesn't work. It zooms it all the way in, and on your time you can play around and see what it's going to do. Later on in part 2 that we're going to do a clip, which we're going along the reef, we'll actually put the stabilize routine on a piece of film going through the reef, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to choose stabilize, and then they have some commands in here. Translation and rotation, and translation plus rotation plus zoom. I use the translation plus rotation plus zoom for 3D film for a variety of reasons, but I just picked that command. But later on, after it analyzes, we can go through all 3 of these, and you don't have to go through the analysis button in order to do that. Under here, what happens is they have what's called a click to analyze. And you just wind up clicking on this button, and this screen comes up, and it's going to wind up analyzing this film. And on my i7 6-core computer, that's going to take about 7 minutes for this 48-second clip right now. On an i7 4-core computer that a lot of you have, it takes much longer. So I'm going to go ahead and wind up letting this film go through its process. So I'm just going to stop this, and we'll be back in a couple minutes, and we'll see what happens when I get back. See you in just a few seconds for you, but 7 minutes and 27 seconds for me. All right, so we got done rendering the file, and here it is with the Boris Continuum Complete optical stabilizer applied. What we're going to wind up noticing here is that we're on full right now. So we have this effect applied. Let's go ahead and play it. We'll see how the playback, whether it's smooth or not. Playing smooth, and then bam, it slows down. Even with this one effect applied, the box cannot handle it. So we'll reduce it to 1/2, and we'll try it again. And I'm going to hit play, and it's playing pretty smooth. We'll just let it run for a little while. Okay, so we're not having any drag on the film. So let's look at this clip. There is no movement going on in that coral. Look at it. Look how much it stabilized that film. That thing is like you're looking at a fish tank. And that is the look that we talk about when we talk about the lockdown effect. We want no movement in the film. Let's just bring it back again. Look at this film. It is not moving one bit. What happens is if we go back to the effect and we just put it onto translation, you know it zoomed out a little. It's just real slight. You see that? Where I'll go translation and zoom back, and then I go to translation, the rotation, and I go the translation, rotation, and zoom. And you can try these to see what's going to have the best effect. You don't have to re-click to analyze once it's gone through its routine. But on here, that we click that button, and there's no movement in the edge of those film, very, very slight. We've attained the lockdown effect. It's great. As part of the guide, I had a long discussion in there about having your camcorder at a 45-degree angle pointing up and having some water in there because the water adds the movement to the scene. Think about these type of things that are going on. So I'm going to wind up bringing this back a little. Let's go ahead and hit the play button. And look, the fish are moving. The water's kind of moving. Man, there's action going on. But that coral is completely steady, like you are filming this above ground on a tripod, on the ground, no movement. That is what this first part was about regarding the optical stabilizer, is that we use Boris Continuum Complete optical stabilizer for tripod shots. That is the best tool that we've been able to find. Now, I use stuff from New Blue FX, and they have a stabilization tool. It didn't work. Now we're going to talk about some issues related to 3D and the left-right eye. And as we talked about, we can come back into the S3D plugin, and we can go side by side. This was the only tool that we found that worked with this particular plugin where the stabilization worked. But one of the unusual items about this is that if you render it out in a left-right eye configuration, when you bring it back in, it doesn't work. So on this particular tool, under the BCC optical stabilizer tool, you have to render a separate left and right eye. And the way you do that is you come in and you put it on left and you do a render, and then you come in and you do it on right and you wind up doing a render, and then you bring both of those clips back in and apply that S3D plugin, as Dave from Adobe was so kind enough to do a great demo on that product. This is the only effect that we use where you are required to render separate left and right eyes, and it was the only effect that we found that worked inside of Adobe. So the Red Giant stabilization tool and the New Blue FX stabilization tools didn't work. The only ones that worked with the Quick S3D plugin inside of Adobe was Boris Continuum Complete, which is kind of cool anyway, because we use so many of their tools. You don't have to go out and buy someone else's tool of another package when it's included as part of Boris Continuum Complete anyway. Done with what I'm going to refer to as part one of stabilization, which is how to stabilize your film when you're on a tripod shot and get that National Geographic's and Hollywood view to your film as if you are looking at a fish tank. So before we get started on part two, which is stabilization of film as you're swimming along the reef line, which is different from a tripod shot. On the views that we want swimming along the reef line, we want kind of a smooth action. We don't want a jerky action. Or I said that Boris Continuum Complete was the only tool that we found that worked in tandem with the Vision 3 Imaging Inc. S3D plugin for Adobe Premiere Pro, and that you had to render separate left-right eyes versus everything else that we've been rendering has been a side-by-side view. I decided to bring back a clip that I made a mistake on, and what I did was I rendered a left-right or side-by-side combination when I had the stabilization tool applied. And we'll see what I'm talking about, because I know that I talked about it and everybody said, well, what is that? What are you talking about? And I'm going to scrub along 2 scenes. And what I want you to notice is because I rendered a left-right eye and not a separate left-right eye, look what's happening over here on the right. You see that leakage coming over from the other eye? And that's what happens if you render in a left-right eye and don't render a separate left-right eye. Here we can kind of see that it was even greater. So I just wanted to give you all an example so everybody understood what happens if you render a side-by-side view and not separate left-right eyes. One of the issues about rendering a separate left-right eye is that it takes just as much time to render a left eye as a right eye. So an example, on a half an hour of film, even on my box, that render takes 35 hours. So on this one particular effect, you have to understand that you're going to do a left eye render and then a right eye render and then bring them back into Adobe, link them again using the S3D plugin from Vision 3 Imaging Inc. You'll be okay from that point moving forward. So all the rest of the renders you can do would just wind up being a side-by-side view of what some people refer to as a left-right half if you're doing 3D. We'll just let this kind of play. I have about 2 minutes of film, and I want you to look at this right side of the screen to make sure everybody understands what that issue is. And we can see it kind of pop in here and back, and it just doesn't work. And that's why if you do the separate, you do a left eye render and then a right eye render, everything will be fine moving forward. You won't have that type of stuff going on. And you can see that all over the place. In fact, it doesn't even stabilize the film when we wind up doing it that way. There's no stabilization at all like we saw on the prior clip. As long as you wind up remembering that, we'll be okay. And I even make mistakes. I rendered this film, had a 40-hour render, and I went back and voila, guess what? It has that problem over on the right side. That's why, as part of the guide, when we gave you render 1, render 2, render 3, and render 4, we have the stabilization as a separate standalone render. So a lot of you may have thought, well, gee, why are they only doing, really one effect as part of render 2? And the reason we do that is because the renders go faster if you only have one effect, and you do have to do a left-right eye. And you can see the leakage going on. If you do a separate left, a separate right, and then come in and link them, you won't have that problem. So I just wanted to give a little kudos here to our team regarding the stabilization routine. When we went through and had that leakage issue, we went back to other vendors' packages and looked at their stabilization routines, and they just were not working. I talked about on our homepage at 3dactionvideoinc.com, which is now equinoxhousingentertainmentinc.com, that we almost gave up numerous times. And this was an example that caused a huge amount of frustration for me personally. Rendered the thing originally trying to do it the right way. That was 80 hours, didn't work. I thought we'd made a mistake. We rendered it again, 80 hours didn't work. Then we went and looked at the Red Giant tools, the new Blue FX stabilization tools, and it wouldn't work. And we were on the verge of failure and collapse at that point in time. And I went back to Boris Continuum Complete again. And I said, let me give it a shot to see what happens when we render a separate left-right eye. And it was really out of desperation at that point, and it worked. This is a prime example, especially related to the 3D space, about how we had to go to multiple tools and multiple vendor packages and spend a lot of money to get these tools to finally figure out what is the sequence of events you have to go through so that you're not going to waste 400 hours of your time pulling your hair out on the same sort of issues that we've had. And that's one of the reasons that we decided to write this guide, was to help the average underwater videographer go through a series of steps that will work, and you won't go through the type of agony, trauma, and then joy at the end when we finally got it to work. That being said, we're going to go to part 2 of looking at stabilization routines swimming along the roof using Adobe Warp Stabilizer, which we found was the best tool and comes a standard part of Adobe Premiere Pro for scenes swimming along the reef. So I'll see you in a couple minutes and we'll get started then.